My name's Theresa Marteau and I'm a behavioural scientist and director of the Behaviour and Health Research Unit in the clinical school here at the University of Cambridge. And I'm also director of studies in psychological and behavioural sciences at Christ College. My work is focused on developing and evaluating interventions to change behaviour at scale. So that's changing behaviour across populations to improve health and to do so equitably. So the main focus is in reducing consumption of high energy food, alcohol and tobacco, which are three of the main drivers of preventable communicable diseases, including type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease and many cancers. The interventions that I've been particularly interested in evaluating involve changing cues in our immediate environments that shape our behaviour, often without our awareness, sometimes called nudges. And I'll come on to give some examples of those in a moment. But one example might be size, the size of packages, portions or tableware, which affect how much we might consume of food, alcohol, and indeed tobacco. Another important strand of my work that links very much with interests in CSaP concerns implementing evidence and trying to understand when interventions make it into policy and when they don't. And the primary interest there is for understanding this as a basis for increasing the chances that more effective interventions end up in policy. So the kinds of questions that I'm grappling with, I'm just going to mention, two big questions really that shape my work. The first is, what does an environment look like that would enable sustained healthy behaviour for all of us? What does that look like? So to break that down a bit, what cues should we be removing or adding in redesigning our physical environments for healthier populations? And we've been addressing this question through field studies that build on evidence synthesis and lab studies. The second big question is, what increases the chances that evidence for effective interventions might be implemented into policy? And that is a huge question. So we've been addressing it just by looking at one component of this, to look at public acceptability for government intervention, which is both a barrier and a potential intervention point for increasing acceptability, and in turn, the likelihood that governments might intervene to implement effective policies. More recently, we've been applying those two questions to improving population health post-COVID-19 through setting up the Lancet Chatham House Commission for doing precisely that. And in that, what we're doing is examining the links between the three major threats to health: infectious disease, which has been well rehearsed through the current pandemic, also non-communicable diseases, which I've already mentioned, which explains 70% of deaths globally. So that includes the cancers, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, lung disease. And the third major threat to health is environmental degradation. And our aim is to try to map what we see as the shared drivers of those three threats, some of which will include unsustainable systems of agriculture, subsidies for harmful products, and overcrowded cities. So we want to map those shared drivers to identify the actions that could affect change across the three domains synergistically to drive extra improvements in human and planetary health. No small thing, but I think increasingly as governments start to think about building back better, there is going to be an efficiency and arguably an increased acceptability both to policymakers and publics of interventions that are going to hit more than one of these threats. I want to think now about what it's important for policymakers to be thinking about. I think two things I want them to be thinking about. The first is engaging with evidence of the effectiveness of interventions for changing behaviour. It's still, not just in general publics, but also in policymakers, one can still see this model, a common sense model, I would call it, of behaviour and changing behaviour, which is an information deficit model, that somehow we need to just correct this deficit, either with generic information or it might be personalised risk information, and somehow that will do it. And while information is important, shifting most behaviour at the scale that's needed, the evidence doesn't support that model. So I really encourage them to engage with the evidence of effectiveness. And the second thing I think it's important for policymakers to be engaging with or thinking about is the evidence on public acceptability of governments intervening to change behaviour. As I've just mentioned, we've shown that this can be tractable, that people are responsive to evidence. And I think we need to move beyond just presenting people with evidence to a deeper engagement. And I think there's some very exciting initiatives that are underway. And I think this is particularly important for policy areas where they require trade-offs that go beyond electoral cycles. And that is most of the challenges that we're facing, thinking about climate change and population health. So we've seen in the UK, the Citizens' Assembly, the Climate Assembly, that was recently completed in the UK. And it extends beyond that to some very interesting models happening elsewhere in the world, such as in Taiwan, where they're talking about digital democracy. So that, I think, is a very exciting area for policymakers. So that's involved one-to-one meetings with policymakers, which I would say remains the core of the value that CSaP provides, I think not only to policymakers, but also to the academics who are engaged with CSaP. So these are the one-to-one meetings with policymakers, working both at national and local levels. So I've had meetings with policymakers working in Cabinet Office, numerous departments, DWP, DEFRA, DHSC, Transport, BEIS, just to name some of those that spring to mind. And policymakers who are wanting to think about tackling a range of problems, including climate change, inequalities, population health, and also new ways of engaging with citizens. I've also participated in roundtables with senior policymakers and other academics in Cambridge, and also participated in several CSaP events, in panel discussions, in just about the last few months. These have been on food policy, climate change, and protecting the economy during the pandemic. And for me, this has been hugely valuable. The meetings one-to-one, they're very much two-way, so that I learn as a researcher what problems policymakers are facing, how they frame the problems, and how they're thinking about potential solutions. And of course, part of the meeting is as well hearing about that frame. I can then think through what evidence that might not necessarily be framed in the same way might be relevant for them to reflect upon. And some of these meetings have led to continued contact with policymakers, as well as researchers that I've met through those one-to-one meetings, as well as the larger CSaP events. And finally, I would say that it's been a great privilege to hear senior policymakers discussing the challenges that they face. Some of the great challenges, such as the almost unimaginable scale of change that's needed to achieve the UK legally binding commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And one particular meeting stands out in my mind. Say this is a small closed meeting of senior policymakers discussing this, further enriched by Richard Wilson, Lord Wilson, former Cabinet Secretary, who chairs this group of senior policymakers, bringing his expertise of working with governments of different hues across many decades, facing many different challenges, with Richard's characteristic wit and wisdom cheering everybody on.